What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to discuss the upcoming show House of the Dragon, which is coming August 21st. I know there are a lot of people out there who feel very justifiably burned by the way that Game of Thrones drew to a close. And then you have George R.R. Martin's fans who are readers of his books who also feel burned because he has never finished A Song of Ice and Fire. The Winds of Winter, we've been waiting for it for 11 years. I don't think it's ever going to come, but one of the many reasons why that book was so delayed and remains so delayed is that he's always working on TV shows like House of the Dragon or writing books like Fire and Blood, which this show is based on, or I should say this show is based on a section of the book known as The Dance of the Dragons, which begins about 129 years after Aegon the Conqueror first took over Westeros, which is at the beginning of the book. So the show is basically going to be ignoring half of the text and focusing on this incredibly bloody chapter where we see the Targaryens at the absolute peak of their power, where they have more viable heirs for the throne than at any other time, as well as more dragons than at any other time. And we see this horrific, bloody civil war of dragon battles and poisoning and backstabbing and battles, etc., where everybody in Westeros is forced to choose sides. And by the end of it, we'll see that the Targaryen family and the dynasty is greatly diminished in power and influence, etc. It's one of the key reasons why they eventually lose power during the time of the Mad King many, many years later. So obviously it's up to the show to do the heavy lifting in terms of introducing a new audience to the new setting, the new characters, where we are in the timeline when the story begins. But I thought with this video I could at least go over some of the major characters and where they are in their stories leading right up to the Dance of the Dragons. And don't worry, I won't go into anything during the actual dance because those are spoilers that'll be featured in the show. But the good news is this show will not run out of runway like Game of Thrones. I think one of the main reasons Game of Thrones got so bad toward the end was that the writers ran out of runway. They didn't know where it was going to go. Whereas with this, even though Fire and Blood is written much more like a history book where like a few lines could be an entire episode of a show, but at least we have the full story. We have the full outline. We have like the major story beats, and it's all about the execution of the writers on the show as to how they fill in those gaps and how they bring these 2 years to life in the context of the show. So let's start with some of the basics. This show was created by Ryan J. Condal, I hope I'm saying his last name correctly, as well as George R. Martin. But in terms of showrunners, it's Ryan J. Condal alongside Miguel Sapochnik, who also directed the first episode, which is coming next Sunday. And I am rooting for these two writers to deliver just because I love the source material so much. I really get off on fake imaginary histories of worlds that have never existed, whether you're talking about Tolkien or George R. Martin or any major fantasy author or Robert Jordan. I love looking at the maps. I love learning the timelines. I love everything about it. I guess if I had half as much interest in our own world as I do in fantasy world, I'd be one of the world's foremost historians. But reading Fire and Blood for a second time, I've just been absolutely enthralled. So even if the show absolutely sucks, at a bare minimum, I want to encourage people to read this book. It is so goddamn good. But here's the sad truth of the sad reality. The more of a fantasy fan that you are, the more that you realize that most fantasy books, most fantasy shows, most fantasy movies, most fantasy video games, and most fantasy comics, most of them suck and suck badly. And if you want to be kind or generous, you could say, oh, it's a lot of well-intentioned people who are basically trying to write in the style of their heroes or trying to live up to the great giants of the past. But if you are a buff for the genre, it's not often where you find an author or a filmmaker or a game franchise where you're like, oh my God, like this is totally my jam. Like recently we saw the movie Spine of Night, the rotoscope animated movie. That was a great example. Or the video game Elden Ring. That was a great example. Both of those absolutely rocked. Or the fantasy novels of Joe Abercrombie. I think there have been 10 so far in his first Law series. I absolutely adore those. But as Charles Dickens famously wrote in A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I kind of feel that way about the fantasy genre right now, where we have a lot of shows and movies coming our way where like HBO and Amazon and Netflix and Paramount and all these major studios and platforms, they're all making a big play on the fantasy genre. They're all making big bets. I mean, Paramount, they got their D&D movie. And obviously Netflix has The Witcher, based on the books of Andrzej Sapkowski. First season was okay. I thought the second season absolutely sucked. And then on Amazon, we've got Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, which looks like it's going to be an absolute disaster. But they also have the Wheel of Time series based on the books by Robert Jordan. And that show is a total train wreck. I hope that HBO is going to deliver one of the rare good ones. And I don't want to be too overly harsh on the other shows because I feel like anytime all these authors are getting their works adapted, that means checks are getting cut, authors are getting rich. That's always a good thing. And for every million people who watch one of these shows or movies, maybe some of them become diehard fantasy junkies on the page or start playing D&D or whatever the case might be. It's always a good thing for the fantasy genre to be popular, but we do need to be honest about which ones suck and which ones are great. But let's get back on task with George R.R. Martin. I'm probably going to screw up a lot of these names just because I've been hearing them in my head without saying them out loud. I will do the best that I can, but obviously once the show starts, we will learn how they choose to pronounce these names. But it gets a little confusing because the Targaryens are all about incest, and they also like reusing family names. So names like Aegon come up a lot, or names like Viserys come up a lot, and Viserys is the name of the character played by Paddy Considine, who is the king on the Iron Throne at the start of the show. But as I mentioned before, the book Fire and Blood reads much more like a history book than like a novel, and when trying to set the stage for any chapter of history, the question always is, where do you begin your tale and where do you end it? I mean, obviously this show is going to be tackling a very narrow portion of the Targaryen history, the 2 years known as the Dance of the Dragons, but the Targaryens were in power for several hundred years, and there were a lot of factors and ingredients that led up to the Dance of the Dragons. And if HBO had been taking requests, I would have just told them to start at the beginning with Aegon the Conqueror and his two sisters conquering Westeros. That would have been absolutely epic and would have eventually given us great chapters with psychos like Maegor the Cruel, one of my favorite Targaryens. But I'm going to do my best just to focus on the key ingredients or the key events involving the main characters that lead up to the first episode of the show, just so you know where you are when the story begins. So during the time of King Viserys, played by Paddy Considine, that was the absolute zenith of the Targaryens in terms of the power in Westeros. We don't really know anything about how powerful they were back in old Valyria. All we know is that they were considered one of the lesser houses when they left and went and formed their base on Dragonstone before eventually invading Westeros. But at this time, you have a lot of princes, you have a lot of princesses, and a hell of a lot of dragons. And it's not like they're a royal family where everybody necessarily gets along. They're all ambitious, or not all ambitious, but many of them are ambitious. Many of them are very bloodthirsty. The Targaryens have the blood of the dragon, and people who have the blood of the dragon, they don't like being told no. And the issue of succession is always a very thorny one, especially at a time where you have so many people with a very viable claim to the throne, because they're coming off a period where King Jaehaerys ruled for a long time. He had a ton of kids, a ton of grandkids, which is a double-edged sword. It means you're not going to have to look hard for an heir, but it means that all these heirs are going to be fighting tooth and nail. I mean, there's these great bits in the book where even the children get into it and like get into fucking knife fights over who has the better claim to the throne. The Targaryens are a bunch of fucking savages. And we all know from our own lives how venomous and savage family squabbles can be and how people can hold grudges against each other for many years to come. But take all those family squabbles that we know from our own reality and then add like Valyrian steel blades that never go dull, as well as dragons which can destroy fleets of ships or burn cities to the ground. And while up to this point in the history of Westeros, there was only one time where you had dragon versus dragon, when Maegor the Cruel, on top of Balerion, ended up ripping this other dragon to pieces, a dragon that was only a quarter of its size, during an earlier question over succession. But it's with this war that'll be featured in the show that we see the Targaryens greatly reduced in power and influence moving forward. And a lot of that blame falls on the shoulders of King Viserys I, because he's a very weak, fat, indecisive king who's very easily influenced by those people around him. One of the main sources of contention is that his daughter, Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, a daughter from his first marriage, who's been named as the Princess of Dragonstone and his heir throughout her entire life, her claim gets threatened by the children from King Viserys' second wife. His second wife, the Lady Alicent Hightower, the daughter of Otto Hightower, who is the hand of the king, and they have a ton of kids. And so what ends up happening is that Rhaenyra, who's a little bit older, all of her kids completely and totally hate all the kids that come from King Viserys' second marriage. And so the stage is set for a very bloody conflict to come. Like I mentioned, some of these kids even get in knife fights long before the official Dance of the Dragons. And at the risk of getting too deep into the weeds on the history of Westeros, One of the big things that I'm sure the show will explore is what's called the Great Council of 101, where it was decided that Viserys would be the successor to King Jaehaerys. But what you have to keep in mind is that legally, according to this council, it was basically decided that the children of male heirs had stronger claims to the throne than the children of female heirs, which then King Viserys immediately contradicts and turns upside down due to his love and affection for Princess Rhaenyra, who's played by Emma D'Arcy in the show, as well as Millie Alcock in certain flashbacks. But as I try to do this character breakdown, I'm starting to get a little tongue-tied because no matter how much I try to keep things simple, every time you mention an event or a character, it unlocks all these other doors and all these other subplots, and it's very hard to stay focused. So let me try to boil this down to the essentials before I completely, totally spiral out of control, because if I'm just reciting all the information that can be found in the book, you should just read the book. So the key things to keep in mind with Princess Rhaenyra is that her father has always said that she is his one true heir above everyone else. One of her closest friends, Sir Criston Cole, who's also a major character in this, he's part of the Kingsguard. He initially starts out on her side, but eventually goes over to the other side. And the two political factions are known as the Greens and the Blacks due to the colors that Lady Alicent and Princess Rhaenyra wear at this one famous tournament where basically the battle lines start to be drawn. Think of like Princess Rhaenyra supporters as one political party and Lady Alicent supporters as yet another political party. And the colors help people realize who they're affiliated with in the battles to come, which leads me to my favorite character in this dark drama who drops in and out of the story because he's always being exiled or sent away for bad behavior. But one of my favorite Targaryens out of all the Targaryens is Prince Daemon Targaryen, who is played by Matt Smith. And he's the bad boy. He's the younger brother of Viserys. And they're the perfect studying contrast because Viserys is kind of fat and lazy and doesn't ride dragons. He rode Balerion a few times once a long time ago. But Prince Daemon, he is a cunning warrior. He wields a Valyrian blade known as Dark Sister. He's always off fighting in wars. He loves hanging out in alleyways and kind of in the slums. He loves prostitutes. He loves gambling. He's the one who created the gold cloaks in King's Landing in the first place, mostly just so he would have an army of thugs so he could do whatever the hell he likes in King's Landing. And while Viserys has some lingering love and affection for his bad boy brother, it's Rhaenyra who really loves and adores Daemon and really looks up to him for advice. And if you believe the rumors, there are all sorts of strange sexual chapters between Rhaenyra and Daemon as well, in spite of being niece and uncle. And what's fun about Fire and Blood is how it's written in a way where, like a real history book, they're drawing upon different sources. And so in the context of the book, they'll say like, well, if you believe this Septon, this is the history. Or if you believe the King's Jester, this is the history. And so some of the conflicting reports are more based on rumor and gossip and that sort of thing. But one of the big scandalous sources of gossip, kind of leading up to the Dance of the Dragons, is that Daemon taught her the art of seduction and how to pleasure a man, because according to the rumors and the gossip, Rhaenyra had a huge crush on Sir Criston Cole, who was a member of the Kingsguard, had a vow of chastity and all that kind of stuff, but that she was going to try to use her feminine wiles to seduce him, and that when she failed, that's one of the things that drove Criston Cole over to the other side. The degree to which this show will explore those rumors and gossip, well, we'll have to wait and see, but we are talking about a prequel to Game of Thrones. I'm hoping that this show will have all the sex and mayhem and incest and craziness that the book has to offer. And along those lines, another thing to keep in mind is that Sir Criston Cole is one of the few people to have beaten Daemon in combat during one of the many tournaments where you've got the Greens and the Blacks and all these different factions kind of trying to defeat one another without actually going to war with each other. But Daemon was using his Valyrian blade Dark Sister, and Sir Criston Cole was using a Morning Star, which is a pretty unconventional, unorthodox weapon. But Sir Criston Cole, he's hell on wheels in combat, so it's a big blow against Rhaenyra when Sir Criston Cole chooses to switch factions. But one of the chief allies for Prince Daemon Targaryen is the Sea Snake, aka Lord Corlys Velaryon. He is the world's greatest sailor. He's also one of the wealthiest people in the world, and he is married to Princess Rhaenys, the so-called queen who never was, who was Viserys' number one rival for succession. And so the Sea Snake feels a little bit like his wife was passed over in favor of Viserys. And so he's a natural ally for Daemon as the rift between Daemon and his brother grows wider and wider. And so with Daemon, you've got a dragon rider who's a badass warrior. And with the Sea Snake, you have this guy with a huge fleet of ships. And prior to the events of the Dance of the Dragons, they go off to the Stone Steps and they fight in their own wars. And I don't know if the show's going to deal with any of that, but the Sea Snake's a very interesting character because he represents all the sea power that Prince Daemon and Princess Rhaenyra could ever ask for in the battles to come. All right, so who else do we need to talk about from the main list of characters? Sir Otto Hightower, played by Rhys Ifans. Sir Otto Hightower, he is not only the hand of the king, but he's also the father of the queen. And he's got a little bit of a love-hate relationship with Viserys because obviously Sir Otto Hightower wants to create conditions where his grandchildren are going to sit on the Iron Throne. But he pushes the issue of succession so frequently that at one point Viserys kicks him out of court, chooses a new hand of the king because he's tired of hearing about it. But eventually Otto Hightower earns his way back into the king's good graces, and you have to remember that the Hightowers are one of the wealthiest families in all of Westeros. They come from Old Town. But in that Rhys Ifans is such a cool, intense, dynamic actor. Expect to see a lot of Sir Otto Hightower. He's a character of enormous power, and a lot of people resent him because the king's so affable and easily persuaded. A lot of people resent the fact that Sir Otto Hightower seems to have even more power than the hand of the king should have. But from his point of view, he's just doing the right thing for his daughter and his grandkids. So in every major political or military conflict, everybody always has their reasons and their own point of view. And all these characters, they all think they're in the right. And at any rate, it's what makes this inevitable conflict so mean and so nasty, because we're talking about one of the greatest military families in the history of this fictional setting. And in a civil war, all the casualties come from the same family, so it makes the losses all the more pronounced. And the last major character, at least according to Wikipedia, is Mysaria, who is the mistress of Daemon. She even gets pregnant with this child at one point, and one of the first early signs of a major rift between Daemon and his brother Viserys is when Daemon takes a dragon's egg and gives it to her so that the child will be a dragon rider. But because Daemon's already married at that point to another woman, Viserys is absolutely outraged and demands that the egg be given back. But she becomes one of the chief advisors to Princess Rhaenyra during the Dance of the Dragons, and so she will wield enormous power as well. At any rate, I'm not going to get into the exact specific moment which officially sparks the Dance of the Dragons or the opening up of hostilities, because I don't know where the show is going to start in the narrative. Who knows? The dance might not even start until the end of the first season. Like, the first season might just be everything leading up to it. But what I hope will happen over the course of the season is that I hope they'll make room for flashback chapters about some of the major characters from Targaryen history, because one of my favorite Targaryens is this character Maegor the Cruel, who committed absolutely unimaginable atrocities, but he makes the Mad King seem like an absolute teddy bear by comparison. But I feel like when you get those chapters about characters like Maegor, it informs your overall impression of who the Targaryens are and reminds you that they are a family of conquerors. They are not, some of them are wise and some of them are just, but in the end, they're all very strong, they're all very militant, and the Dance of the Dragons is just the natural byproduct of too much success, too much prosperity, where they have too many dragons, too many Targaryens. Inevitably, they were going to have to come to blows. But another reason I want to see flashback episodes is that it would be a shame to just throw away the first half of the book, which is just so goddamn good and so riveting. So all roads lead back to Fire and Blood. It gets a very strong recommendation from me. And like I said before, if all these fantasy shows lead to more people reading or perhaps even writing great fantasy books, awesome. I will chalk that up as a win. I will definitely be in front of my TV opening night of this show, hopefully absolutely riveted. I will be doing a review of the first episode. Whether or not I'll continue reviewing the show all depends upon whether or not the show is any good. But as we all know, when it comes to Game of Thrones, some episodes are amazing, some episodes absolutely suck. Hopefully they put their best foot forward first with this first season. But I'll be satisfied if they can at least get Prince Daemon Targaryen's character right. I love villains. I love unapologetic villains. I love villains who embrace their role as a villain. And there's something about him, and he rides a dragon named Bloodworm. He wields Dark Sister. He's hell on wheels in combat. He looks cool as shit. He's kind of evil incarnate, or at least at a bare minimum, very corrupt. Just to give you an idea of how mean-spirited he can be. At one point, he was considered second in line to the throne behind King Viserys, and when King Viserys had his first son, he only lived for a day before he died, and Daemon was overheard in a tavern that night, drunkenly laughing about how his nephew had been heir for a day, and it's one of those situations where Viserys was so outraged when he heard this that Daemon was exiled to Dragonstone for a good long while. But as we saw in the original show Game of Thrones, sometimes it's the villains that are the most fascinating characters, especially villains who have have some redeeming qualities. Like, look at Jaime Lannister. First episode of that show, he breaks the back of a kid, but by the end of the show, everybody loved and adored Jaime Lannister. But I'm rambling at this point. Time to wrap this up. I'm looking forward to covering the show a week from now. When I started the video, I was like, oh, this would be so easy. I'll just go over the main characters and what I like about them, and I'll just move on. But once you start discussing the history, it's so complex and so detail-oriented. It's very hard to discuss it without getting completely, totally sidetracked in a million different little tangents. So I hope I made some sense while trying to bring some clarity to this vast, sprawling saga. But if what I'm saying is making no sense, like I said before, just read the book. But if you want to talk more about George R.R. Martin or fantasy or the show or whatever, just hunt me down on Twitter at Geeking Out. And like everybody, I'll be very curious to see how good or bad this show might be a week from now. Fingers crossed it'll be good, but that's all I got to say for now. So as always, onwards and upwards.